The chandeliers of Pemberton House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light cascading down upon the assembled glory of London's finest families like liquid gold poured from some celestial vessel, and in the shadows cast by the third marble pillar from the grand staircase stood Miss Eleanor Hartley, precisely where she had positioned herself at every ball for the past 4 seasons. The pillar was her sanctuary, her chosen refuge in a world that demanded visibility she could not provide, and she had measured its dimensions with the careful attention of a cartographer, mapping safe harbors wide enough to conceal her unremarkable figure, positioned close enough to the refreshment room that her presence seemed purposeful rather than pathetic, far enough from the dancing that she need not witness too closely, the spectacle of courtship from which she was perpetually excluded. She wore a gown of dove-grey silk, modest and well-made, but without the embellishments that drew the eye, for her mother had long ago ceased spending precious funds on a daughter who stubbornly refused to bloom into beauty or charm. Mrs. Hartley stood across the ballroom even now, her fan moving with agitated precision as she spoke with Lady Thornbury, no doubt making excuses for Eleanor's position. Spinning some tale of delicate health or studious disposition, anything to explain why her eldest daughter stood alone while girls half her wit and a quarter her education twirled in the arms of eligible gentlemen. Eleanor did not begrudge her mother the invention. She had made peace with her plainness years ago, had accepted that her mouse-brown hair and unremarkable features, her tall, thin frame and serious countenance, marked her as unsuitable for the marriage market that valued porcelain prettiness and practiced coquetry. Instead, she observed, and in observation found a strange contentment that she suspected the whirling dancers would never know. She watched the intricate choreography of ambition and desire, noted how Miss Weatherby angled herself toward Lord Ashford, how the Pemberton twins moved in synchronized desperation toward any gentleman with a fortune, how the widows clustered like elegant crows assessing the season's prospects. And then there was the Duke of Ashworth, impossibly handsome and utterly unreachable, surrounded as always by a constellation of hopeful debutantes and their sharp-eyed mothers, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, his tall form moving with the unconscious grace of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Eleanor had long ago trained herself not to watch him too intently, for that way lay foolishness and pain, yet her gaze found him nonetheless, drawn as a compass needle finds north, before she forced her attention back to the safer territory of wallpaper patterns and architectural details. She had brought no book tonight, though her fingers itched for one, for her mother had specifically forbidden it after the Hastings ball, where Eleanor had been discovered reading Plutarch in the conservatory, while 3 perfectly suitable gentlemen had inquired after her whereabouts. The evening wore on in its predictable rhythms, and when the clock struck midnight, Eleanor slipped away as she always did, retrieving her cloak from an inattentive footman and stepping into the cool London night, disappearing into the darkness as completely as if she had never existed at all, her absence noted by no one save the pillar itself, which stood patient and faithful, waiting for her inevitable return. The Duke of Ashworth stood near the terrace doors, a glass of champagne in his hand that he had not tasted, his attention appearing to rest upon Lord Pemberton's enthusiastic recounting of a hunting expedition, while his actual focus remained fixed upon the third marble pillar from the grand staircase, where Miss Eleanor Hartley had positioned herself with the precision of long practice, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had become his constant companion at these gatherings, this strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy that came from observing someone who believed herself unobserved. He had noticed her first 3 years ago, though she would never know it, at the Weatherby garden party where she had slipped away from the archery competition to sit beneath a willow tree with a volume of poetry, her expression one of such complete absorption that he had stopped mid-conversation with Lady Margaret something or other, to simply watch the way sunlight filtered through the leaves to illuminate her serious face, the way her lips moved slightly as she read, the way she seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from the performing, posturing, peacocking that consumed everyone else. Since that afternoon, he had found her at every event, had learned to anticipate her hiding places, had begun to catalogue her patterns with an attention that would have alarmed him, had he allowed himself to examine it too closely. She favoured pillars and alcoves, preferred positions near libraries or conservatories, always wore muted colours that helped her blend into the background, always departed precisely at midnight, as if bound by some Cinderella curse. Though unlike that fairy tale heroine, she left behind no glass slipper, no trace of her presence, save the faint impression in his memory. His curiosity had deepened into something more troubling over the months and years. This fascination with a woman who seemed to want nothing that other women desired, who appeared content in her solitude, while others schemed and strategized for his attention, who read philosophy while they practiced pretty speeches, who observed life while they performed it. He knew it was madness, knew his duty lay in selecting a bride from among the eligible beauties who surrounded him like beautiful, ambitious flowers. Knew his aunt the Dowager Duchess would be appalled at his interest in a woman with no fortune, no exceptional beauty, no powerful family connections. Yet he could not shake the conviction that Eleanor Hartley possessed something infinitely more valuable than any of those attributes, something authentic and true that he desperately craved in a world of elaborate pretense. Tonight he had watched her slip behind her pillar, had seen the careful way she positioned herself to remain unnoticed, had observed her observing the ballroom with those intelligent grey eyes that missed nothing, and he had felt the overwhelming urge to cross the room, to speak to her, to ask her what she saw when she looked at this glittering assembly of vanity and ambition. But he had restrained himself as he always did, uncertain how to approach someone who so clearly wished to remain unapproached, someone who had built her invisibility into a fortress he did not know how to breach without causing her distress. Now he watched her retrieve her cloak, watched her disappear into the night as she always did, and he stood motionless at the terrace doors, champagne untasted in his hand, wondering how much longer he could endure this strange half-life of watching and wanting, of knowing and not knowing, of being surrounded by people while feeling utterly, profoundly alone. The Pemberton soirée had seemed safe enough when Eleanor agreed to attend, for such intimate gatherings typically allowed her to position herself near the pianoforte, where she might turn pages for Lady Pemberton's accomplished daughter and thus appear occupied rather than abandoned. But she had not accounted for her mother's desperation, had not anticipated the steel determination in Mrs. Hartley's eyes when she materialized at Eleanor's elbow with the Duke of Ashworth himself in tow, and Eleanor felt her stomach plummet to the vicinity of her sensible slippers as her mother executed what could only be described as an ambush introduction. "Your Grace, may I present my eldest daughter, Miss Eleanor Hartley." Mrs. Hartley announced with the triumphant air of a general securing a strategic position, and Eleanor wanted nothing more than to disappear into the wallpaper, to dissolve into the very air itself, for she could feel the eyes of every person in the drawing-room turning toward them, could sense the collective assessment and inevitable dismissal that would follow, could already hear the whispered speculation about why the Duke was wasting his attention on the Hartley wallflower. She managed a curtsy that felt awkward and ungainly, her limbs seeming to belong to someone else entirely, and when she raised her eyes to his face, she found herself stammering something incomprehensible about the weather, though it was April and the weather required no commentary whatsoever, and she wished fervently that the oriental carpet beneath her feet would develop a sudden capacity for swallowing mortified young women whole. But the Duke did not wear the expression of polite boredom she had expected, did not offer the cursory pleasantries before making his escape that she had braced herself to endure. Instead, he bowed with a grace that seemed genuine rather than performative, and his voice when he spoke held a warmth that confused her utterly. "Miss Hartley, I am delighted to make your acquaintance at last," he said, and there was something in the phrasing in that word, "at last," that she could not quite decipher. Her mother, sensing an opportunity, launched into an elaborate recitation of Eleanor's accomplishments, most of which were either exaggerated or entirely invented, and Eleanor felt heat flooding her cheeks as Mrs. Hartley described her as an accomplished pianist, which she was not, and a watercolorist of some talent, which was laughable until the Duke gently interrupted with a question that caught Eleanor entirely off guard. "I notice you carry a book, Miss Hartley," he said, gesturing to the slim volume she had tucked beneath her arm, her constant companion and comfort. "Might I ask what you are reading?" The question was so unexpected, so far removed from the usual litany of weather and health inquiries, that Eleanor answered without thinking, "Montaigne's Essays, Your Grace," and then immediately regretted it. For what gentleman wished to discuss French philosophy at a soirée? Yet his eyes lit with what appeared to be genuine interest, and he asked which essay she found most compelling, And somehow, she found herself actually talking, about the essay on solitude, about Montaigne's observations on the necessity of withdrawing from the world to know oneself, and the Duke listened with an attention that seemed entirely focused, entirely present, as if her thoughts mattered, as if she mattered. When he finally took his leave, bowing over her hand with a courtesy that left her breathless, Eleanor stood in stunned confusion, watching him move across the room to greet Lady Pemberton, and she could not reconcile what had just occurred with everything she understood about her place in the world. And when her mother began chattering excitedly about the Duke's attentions, Eleanor shook her head and murmured that it was merely politeness, nothing more, though somewhere deep in her chest, a small, treacherous hope had begun to unfurl like a flower seeking light. 3 weeks passed in which Eleanor attempted to convince herself that the encounter at the Pemberton soirée had been nothing more than a moment of politeness, a gentleman's courtesy to an awkward wallflower whose mother had thrust her into his path, and she had nearly succeeded in dismissing it from her mind when she entered Hatchard's lending library on a grey Thursday afternoon, and found the Duke of Ashworth standing in the history section, a volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall open in his hands, his expression one of such complete absorption that she felt she was witnessing something private, something not meant for public view. Her first instinct was to retreat, to slip away before he noticed her presence, but the library was small and her movement caught his attention, and when he looked up and recognition sparked in his eyes, followed immediately by what appeared to be genuine pleasure, she found herself rooted to the spot, clutching her returned books against her chest like a shield. "Miss Hartley," he said, closing his volume and offering a bow that seemed absurdly formal in the cramped confines of the history section, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was pleased to see her, which made no sense whatsoever, given that he could have the company of any woman in London merely by expressing the slightest interest. She managed a curtsy, her books wobbling dangerously, and murmured something about not wishing to disturb his reading, but he shook his head and asked if she had come seeking anything in particular, and somehow she found herself telling him about her search for a reliable translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and his face lit with the same genuine interest she had witnessed at the soirée. "I have read 3 translations," he said, moving closer to examine the shelves beside her, near enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something clean and masculine, "and I find George Long's version most faithful to the original intent, though Robin Hard's modern translation has merit for accessibility." They spoke for 20 minutes about Stoic philosophy, about the concept of accepting what one cannot control, about finding peace in adversity, and Eleanor felt something shifting in her perception of him, felt the gleaming surface of his title beginning to crack, to reveal a mind that was genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, and when he recommended a small bookshop in Covent Garden that specialized in classical philosophy, she found herself smiling without the usual self-consciousness that accompanied her rare moments of pleasure. "Then he did something that stole the breath from her lungs," he asked, with a formality that seemed to cost him something, if he might have permission to call upon her at her home, and Eleanor stared at him in such complete shock that he actually appeared uncertain. This man, who commanded every room he entered, this Duke, who could have any woman he desired. "I, Your Grace, I cannot imagine why you would wish to," she began, but he interrupted gently, saying that he would very much like to continue their conversation about philosophy and literature, if she would permit it, and she heard herself agreeing, her voice barely above a whisper, before her rational mind could intervene with all the reasons why this was impossible, why his interest could not be what it appeared, why she should protect herself from the inevitable disappointment. Walking home through the London streets, her new books forgotten in her distracted hands, Eleanor's thoughts tumbled over one another in chaotic succession, hope and disbelief warring within her chest, and she could not shake the memory of how he had looked at her in that library, as if she were someone worth seeing, worth knowing, worth the extraordinary courtesy of a formal call. The Duke of Ashworth arrived at the Hartley residence precisely at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as his magnificent carriage drew to a halt before their modest townhouse, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she wondered if it might actually break through bone and flesh, and when Morrison, their ancient butler, announced his grace, with a gravity that suggested he were presenting royalty, which in essence he was, Eleanor's mother practically vibrated with barely suppressed excitement, her face arranged in an expression meant to convey casual sophistication, but achieving only transparent social climbing ambition. Mrs. Hartley monopolized the first quarter hour with observations about the weather, inquiries into the Duke's family, and thinly veiled references to Eleanor's supposed accomplishments, each word making Eleanor wish she could simply evaporate into the threadbare upholstery of the settee, and she could see the Duke's patience beginning to wear thin around the edges, though his courtesy never wavered, until finally he turned to Eleanor and asked, with a formality that somehow conveyed genuine interest, if she might do him the honor of walking with him in the garden. The garden was hardly worthy of the name, being little more than a small courtyard with a few rose bushes that her father tended with more optimism than skill, but the Duke examined it as if it were the grounds of some great estate, commenting on the climbing roses with an expertise that surprised her, and when they had achieved sufficient distance from the house that her mother's eager face was no longer visible in the window, he asked her not about her musical accomplishments or her needlework or any of the other tedious markers by which young ladies were typically measured, but rather what she had been reading since their meeting at the library, and Eleanor found herself telling him about her attempts to read Gibbon, about how she became lost in the footnotes and digressions, about how she suspected she was meant to find it drier than she did. He laughed at this, a genuine sound of pleasure rather than polite acknowledgement, and confessed that he too had a weakness for Gibbon's elaborate footnotes, that he sometimes read them in preference to the main text, and they spoke for nearly an hour about history and philosophy, about Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, about whether virtue could be taught or must be innate, and Eleanor felt something unfurling within her chest, some tightly closed part of herself beginning to open like a flower that had been kept too long in shadow. The Duke asked her opinions not as a test of her education, but as if her thoughts genuinely mattered to him, as if her perspective on Cicero's rhetoric or Plutarch's biographies held actual value, and she found herself speaking with an ease she had never experienced in conversation with anyone outside her immediate family, found herself forgetting to monitor her words for potential embarrassment, forgetting to maintain the careful guard she had constructed around her inner world. When he finally took his leave, he asked if he might call again, and there was something in his eyes, some quality of hope mixed with uncertainty, that made her realize with sudden clarity that he was not merely being polite, that his interest was not the casual courtesy of a gentleman to a wallflower, and she heard herself saying yes, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions rioting through her chest. And after he departed, she stood in the garden for a long moment, touching the rose he had admired, allowing herself the dangerous indulgence of hope. The whispers began at Lady Weatherby's garden party, 3 days after the Duke's second call at the Hartley residence, carried on the wind like pollen that irritated and inflamed, and Eleanor first became aware of them when she noticed Miss Arabella Thornton and Miss Caroline Wexford watching her with expressions that mingled amusement and disdain, their fans fluttering in that particular rhythm that suggested gossip of the most delicious kind. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was being oversensitive, that years of social invisibility had made her paranoid about sudden attention. But then she attended the Bromley musicale the following week and heard her own name spoken in tones of incredulous speculation as she passed a cluster of young ladies in the refreshment room, their voices dropping to whispers that somehow managed to be more audible than ordinary speech, and she caught fragments that pierced her like carefully aimed arrows. The Duke of Ashworth. That plain little Hartley girl. Cannot possibly be serious. Perhaps a wager. Maybe he lost a bet. Charitable gesture to a wallflower. Amusing himself. He will tire of the novelty soon enough. Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her lemonade, the crystal glass rattling against the silver tray, and she felt the familiar walls of her carefully constructed invisibility crumbling around her, felt exposed in a way she had never experienced, even in her most mortifying social moments, because being ignored was one thing, but being noticed only to be mocked was quite another, and she found herself moving instinctively toward the one place that had always offered sanctuary, the shadowed space behind a large marble pillar, near the terrace doors where the light from the chandeliers did not quite reach. She pressed her back against the cool stone and closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe normally, telling herself that she had known this attention could not be real, that she had been foolish to allow herself even the smallest measure of hope, that the Duke's interest had been exactly what these cruel girls suggested, some incomprehensible game or obligation or momentary whim that would pass and leave her more exposed and humiliated than she had ever been in her invisible years. "Miss Hartley." His voice came from directly beside her, and she opened her eyes to find the Duke standing there, his expression thunderous, his jaw tight with an anger she had never seen him display, and she realized with horror that he must have witnessed her retreat, must have seen her scurrying back to her shadows like some frightened creature fleeing the light. "Your Grace, I did not see you arrive," she managed, her voice barely steady, and she attempted to arrange her features into some semblance of composure. But he was looking at her with such intensity that she felt stripped bare, felt that he could see every wound that society's whispers had inflicted, every doubt that had taken root in the fertile soil of her insecurities. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly, and there was something dangerous in his tone, something that made her realize that beneath his unfailing courtesy there existed a capacity for genuine anger, and when she tried to dismiss it as nothing, he stepped closer and repeated the question with a gentleness that somehow conveyed absolute insistence, and she found herself telling him, her voice breaking slightly on the words about wages and charity and amusing diversions. And she watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, watched a muscle jump in his jaw, watched his eyes grow cold in a way that suggested whoever had spoken those words would soon regret their cruelty, and something in his visible fury on her behalf made her chest constrict with an emotion she dared not name. The Duke did not release her from his gaze, and after a moment of charged silence he said quietly, "Walk with me in the garden, Miss Hartley, I beg you." And though every instinct told her to refuse, to retreat further into her safe shadows, something in his voice compelled her to nod, and she found herself following him through the terrace doors into the cooling evening air, where the scent of night-blooming jasmine hung heavy, and the sounds of the musicale faded to a distant murmur. They walked in silence for several minutes, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, and Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the path before her, unable to bear the weight of whatever he might say, whatever explanation or dismissal or apology he might offer. But when he finally spoke, his words were not what she expected at all. "I have watched you for years, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice low and intense, and she stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat, and he turned to face her fully, his expression illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the house. "I have watched you stand behind pillars at the Ashford ball, hide in alcoves at the Pemberton soiree, and slip into libraries during the Waverley musicale and the Thornton gathering, and a dozen other events where everyone else performed their assigned roles with tedious precision. And I have wondered about you, wondered what thoughts occupied your mind while others were occupied with gossip and schemes and the endless, exhausting performance of society." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain that no one could have noticed her careful invisibility, her practiced art of disappearing in plain sight, and she heard herself whisper, "Why would you notice me? I am nothing, nobody. I have spent years ensuring that I remain unnoticed." And he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "That is precisely why I noticed you," he said, and there was something almost fierce in his tone now, something that suggested he had been holding these words inside for far too long. "In a world of peacocks preening and displaying, you were the only creature content to simply be. You were the only person in any ballroom who seemed to possess an inner life more interesting than the performance happening around you. You were authentic in a sea of artifice, genuine in a world of pretense, and I found myself looking for you at every event, found myself disappointed when you were not there, found myself watching the corners and shadows because I knew that was where I would find you." She shook her head, unable to reconcile his words with everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, about the nature of worth and visibility. "But I am plain," she said, the words emerging unbidden, all the years of her mother's disappointment and society's dismissal condensed into that single admission, and he looked at her with such genuine confusion that she wondered if he had somehow failed to notice what everyone else saw so clearly. "You are not plain," he said firmly, reaching out as if to touch her face before stopping himself, his hand falling back to his side. "You are quiet, which is not the same thing at all. You are thoughtful and observant, and possessed of a mind that finds genuine pleasure in ideas rather than appearances. And I would choose your company over the most acclaimed beauty in London. I would choose one honest conversation with you over 1,000 tedious exchanges with women who have nothing to say beyond what they think I wish to hear. Eleanor felt something cracking inside her chest, some long-held belief about herself beginning to fracture, and tears burned behind her eyes, though she fought desperately to contain them, and the Duke watched her with an expression so tender that it made her heart ache with a longing she had never permitted herself to feel. And in that moment, standing in a modest garden behind a modest house, with a man who should have been impossibly beyond her reach, Eleanor Hartley allowed herself to consider the terrifying possibility that perhaps she had been wrong about everything. Perhaps worth was not measured in beauty or fortune or social position. Perhaps being seen, truly seen by one person who mattered, was more valuable than being admired by hundreds who did not. The weeks that followed became a season of gradual revelation. As spring deepened into early summer, and the Duke's visits to the Hartley residence took on the comfortable regularity of ritual, arriving each Tuesday and Friday afternoon with such punctuality that Eleanor found herself listening for his carriage, found herself arranging her hair with more care than she had ever bothered with before, found herself admitting in the privacy of her thoughts that she anticipated these visits with a longing that both thrilled and terrified her. He brought her books, volumes carefully selected from his own library or procured from shops he had visited specifically with her tastes in mind, and each gift demonstrated an attention to detail that suggested he had been truly listening during their conversations, truly absorbing the casual mentions she made of authors she admired or subjects that intrigued her, and she marveled at how he remembered that she had expressed curiosity about medieval history during their second conversation, how he had noted her fondness for poetry that explored the natural world, how he seemed to catalogue every small revelation she offered and transform it into tangible evidence of his regard. Their walks in the modest Hartley garden became longer, their conversations deeper, and Eleanor found herself speaking of things she had never articulated to anyone, her thoughts about the books she read and the observations she made about human nature and the quiet philosophies she had developed during her years of watching from the shadows. And he listened with an intensity that made her feel that her words held value, that her ideas mattered, that the internal world she had cultivated in solitude was not merely the refuge of a social failure, but something worthy of genuine interest. In turn, he began to reveal his own loneliness, the isolation that came from being perpetually on display, perpetually sought after for his title and fortune rather than his person, and she learned that beneath the polished exterior of the Duke of Ashworth existed a man who craved authenticity as desperately as she had craved invisibility, who found the endless social performances as exhausting as she did, who had spent years surrounded by people yet feeling fundamentally alone, and this shared understanding created between them a bond that transcended the vast differences in their social positions. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing, arrived the following week with a particular variety of tea she had said she enjoyed, asked thoughtful questions about a comment she had made days earlier, treated her observations about literature and life with the same seriousness he might accord a scholar's treatise, and these accumulating gestures of attention built within her a growing certainty that his regard was genuine, that whatever had begun between them was real and substantial and unlike anything she had imagined possible for herself. Months passed in this manner, the summer heat giving way to the first cool whispers of autumn, and Eleanor noticed changes in herself that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the way she moved through the world, a new confidence in her voice when she spoke, a readiness to meet his eyes rather than looking away, a willingness to share her thoughts without the paralyzing fear that they would be dismissed or mocked, and she realized with a mixture of joy and terror that she was no longer merely accepting his attention or enjoying his company, but had crossed some invisible threshold into territory far more dangerous, had allowed herself to fall in love with him, despite every warning voice in her head that insisted such feelings could only lead to heartbreak. And yet she could not bring herself to guard against it, could not retreat back into the safety of indifference, could only surrender to the overwhelming reality that the Duke of Ashworth had become essential to her happiness in a way that left her utterly vulnerable and entirely, impossibly, hopelessly in love. The fragile happiness Eleanor had begun to permit herself shattered on a crisp October afternoon when the Duke's aunt, The formidable Dowager Duchess of Northmere arrived at the Hartley residence in a carriage so grand it caused the neighbours to gather at their windows, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room as this imposing woman, draped in silk and diamonds, and the absolute certainty of her own superiority, swept into the house with the imperious bearing of one accustomed to immediate obedience. Mrs. Hartley had hastily withdrawn to arrange tea, leaving Eleanor alone with a woman whose cold assessment made her feel like a specimen being examined for defects, and the Dowager Duchess wasted no time on pleasantries, stating bluntly, "I have come to discuss my nephew's inexplicable attachment to you, Miss Hartley, an attachment which I assure you cannot and will not result in marriage." And Eleanor felt the familiar ice of shame spreading through her chest, even as she forced herself to meet those glacial eyes. The litany of her inadequacies was delivered with surgical precision. No fortune to speak of, no beauty to recommend her, no family connections of any significance, no accomplishments beyond a well-read mind which the Duchess dismissed as irrelevant to the duties of a Duchess. And with each point, Eleanor felt herself shrinking back into the shell she had so briefly emerged from, felt all her old certainties about her worthlessness reasserting themselves with crushing force, and when her mother returned with tea, Eleanor excused herself on the pretext of a headache and fled to her room, but not before she heard the Duchess say clearly, "The boy is lonely and has mistaken intellectual compatibility for something deeper, but he will come to his senses. Once he understands the impossible position such a match would place him in, the mockery it would invite, the damage to his standing." Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway outside the drawing-room, her hand pressed against the wall for support, and heard her mother's obsequious agreement, heard the Duchess continue, "She may be a pleasant enough girl in her way, but she is wholly unsuitable for a man of his position, and I trust you will have the good sense to discourage this attachment before it progresses further and causes embarrassment to all parties involved." And something inside Eleanor crumbled completely, all the hope she had been nurturing withering like flowers touched by frost. She wrote to the Duke that evening, a brief note pleading illness and requesting that he suspend his visits indefinitely, and when he appeared at the house the following day she refused to see him, sending word through her mortified mother that she was indisposed, and she heard his voice in the entrance hall, heard the concern and confusion in his tone, heard him ask if he had given offence, and it took every ounce of strength she possessed not to rush down the stairs and throw herself into his arms and beg him to make the world disappear. The days that followed were a descent into familiar darkness, as Eleanor returned to her old patterns of invisibility, declining all invitations, spending her hours in her room with books that could no longer hold her attention, and she knew she was breaking both their hearts, but convinced herself it was necessary, convinced herself that the Duchess was right, that she had been a fool to imagine herself worthy of him, that whatever he felt for her now would inevitably transform into resentment once society made clear the price of his choice, and she told herself she was saving him from a terrible mistake, even as she felt her own heart splintering into pieces too small to ever be made whole again. Autumn descended upon London with unusual severity that year, the trees shedding their leaves in great bronze cascades that choked the streets and parks, and the cold seemed to settle not merely in the air, but in Eleanor's very bones, as she withdrew completely from society, declining every invitation with the same formulaic excuse of indisposition, until the invitations themselves ceased arriving, and she became a ghost even in the social circles where she had always been peripheral. The Duke searched for her with a desperation that became the subject of drawing-room gossip, arriving at every ball and assembly, only to scan the room with barely concealed disappointment, checking behind the pillars and in the alcoves where she had once stationed herself, lingering near the libraries and gardens as though she might materialize from the shadows, and society watched this spectacle with a mixture of fascination and cruel amusement, the whispers growing louder with each event where he appeared without her, speculation running rampant about what had caused the sudden rupture of their courtship. Eleanor's mother oscillated between fury and despair, raging one day about the opportunity Eleanor had squandered and weeping the next over her daughter's incomprehensible stubbornness, but Eleanor endured these tirades in silence, locked in a prison of her own making, and she told herself daily that she had done the right thing, that she had saved them both from inevitable heartbreak, even as the pain of his absence felt like a physical wound that refused to heal. The letters began arriving within a week of her withdrawal, delivered by his footman to the Hartley residence with such regularity that the servants began to anticipate them, and Eleanor's mother brought them to her room with expressions ranging from hope to exasperation. But Eleanor could not bring herself to open them, could not bear to read words that would make her resolve waver, and so they accumulated on her writing desk, a growing testament to her cowardice and his persistence. She spent her days in a fog of melancholy, attempting to lose herself in books that now reminded her only of him, of the conversations they had shared, and the future she had been foolish enough to imagine. And the autumn rains matched her mood, grey and relentless, turning the world outside her window into a watercolor wash of sorrow. Charlotte, her younger sister, watched this deterioration with increasing concern, knocking on Eleanor's door each evening with offers of company that were gently refused, and Eleanor knew she was worrying her family, knew her mother's disappointment had transformed into genuine fear for her well-being, but she could not seem to rouse herself from the darkness that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. The Duke, meanwhile, refused to accept her silence as finality, appeared at the Hartley residence on 3 separate occasions requesting to see her, and each time Eleanor hid in her room while her mortified mother made excuses, and she could hear his voice through the floorboards, hear the barely controlled frustration and hurt in his tone, and she pressed her hands over her ears like a child trying to block out reality. Society's speculation about their failed courtship grew more elaborate with each passing week, some suggesting she had been discovered in some scandalous indiscretion, others claiming he had realized her unsuitability and withdrawn his attentions, and a few romantic souls whispered that perhaps she had nobly removed herself from consideration, knowing the match would damage his standing, and ironically this last theory, the one closest to the truth, was the least believed, for who could imagine plain Eleanor Hartley possessing such tragic nobility? The letters continued to arrive with unwavering regularity, and Eleanor continued not to open them, and autumn deepened toward winter, and she remained trapped in her self-imposed exile, convinced she had made the only possible choice even as it slowly destroyed her. Charlotte Hartley had inherited none of her sister's tendency toward self-effacement, possessing instead a directness that sometimes bordered on impertinence, and on a grey November afternoon she entered Eleanor's room without knocking, crossed to the window where Eleanor sat staring at nothing, and announced with characteristic bluntness, "This has gone on quite long enough, and I cannot remain silent while you destroy yourself over a misery entirely of your own creation." Eleanor turned from the window, startled by the unprecedented severity in her sister's tone, and Charlotte continued before she could offer any protest, settling herself on the edge of Eleanor's bed with the determined air of one prepared for battle. "I have watched you these past weeks transform from someone who had finally discovered happiness into this pale ghost, and I have listened to Mama's theories and the servants' whispers and society's ridiculous speculations, but none of them have seen what I have seen, which is the Duke arriving at our door week after week, despite your refusal to see him, have seen the expression on his face when he is turned away. And I tell you, Eleanor, that is not the face of a man performing duty or acting from pity or any of the other terrible things you have convinced yourself must be true." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to offer some defense of her decision, but Charlotte raised a hand imperiously, so much like their mother in that gesture that Eleanor nearly smiled despite her misery, and her sister continued, "You think you are being noble, protecting him from the consequences of a poor match, saving him from eventual regret and society's censure, but have you considered that perhaps you are simply being a coward, that perhaps you are using the Dowager Duchess's cruelty as an excuse to retreat into the safety of your old invisibility, because being seen, truly seen and chosen, terrifies you more than being overlooked ever did?" The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy, and Charlotte's voice softened slightly as she continued, "I am only 17, Eleanor, and I have never been in love, but I have watched you with him these past months, and I have seen something I did not think existed outside of novels, a meeting of minds and hearts so complete that it transformed you entirely, and you were happy, genuinely happy, perhaps for the first time in your life, and now you have thrown that away because an embittered old woman confirmed all your worst beliefs about yourself." Eleanor felt tears beginning to slide down her cheeks, the first she had permitted herself since her self-imposed exile began, and Charlotte moved to sit beside her, taking her hand with surprising gentleness, The question you must ask yourself is not whether you are worthy of him, for worthiness is not some objective measure that can be calculated based on fortune and beauty and social position, but rather whether you love him enough to be brave, to step out from behind your pillars and into the light, even knowing that some will judge and mock and find you wanting. Because Eleanor, he has already chosen you, has chosen you despite and perhaps even because of all the things that make you different from the glittering creatures who have pursued him for years. And by refusing to see him, you are not protecting him, but rather denying him the right to make his own choice, which is perhaps the greatest insult you could offer. The words settled into Eleanor's consciousness like seeds in fertile soil, and she found herself remembering not the Dowager Duchess's cruel assessment, but rather the Duke's face as he had looked at her in the library, in the garden, during their long conversations, and she realized with sudden clarity that Charlotte was right, and that she had been hiding, not from his potential rejection, but from the terrifying vulnerability of being chosen, of being loved, of mattering to someone who mattered to the world. And she whispered, "What if I attend one more event, just one, and he is no longer there waiting? What if my absence has finally convinced him to give up?" Charlotte squeezed her hand and replied with the absolute certainty of youth, "Then you will have your answer and can return to your shadows with a clear conscience. But Eleanor, I do not think that is what you will find, for I have seen his constancy these past weeks, and I believe if you emerge from this self-imposed prison, you will discover he has been waiting all along, and then the choice will truly be yours, to step forward into love or retreat forever into safety, and you must decide which future you can bear to live with." The Winterbourne ball blazed with such opulence that it seemed to Eleanor, standing in the entrance hall with her heart hammering against her ribs, that all of London society had gathered in this one glittering space to witness either her redemption or her final humiliation, and she had nearly turned back 3 times during the carriage ride, her mother's excited chatter washing over her unheard, while Charlotte squeezed her hand with silent encouragement. And now as she stood on the threshold of the ballroom, she felt the old familiar urge to seek the shadows, to find her customary pillar and observe rather than participate. And indeed her feet carried her almost unconsciously toward that marble column near the eastern wall, the one partially concealed by an enormous potted fern, the one from which she had watched countless balls unfold without ever truly being part of them. She positioned herself in the familiar spot with a sense of coming home, though whether it was a homecoming she should celebrate or mourn, she could not say, and the ballroom swirled before her in its usual patterns of silk and candlelight, the orchestra playing a waltz that seemed to mock her isolation. And she told herself she had done what Charlotte asked, had attended one more event, had given him the opportunity to find her if he still wished to, though surely by now his patience must have worn thin. Surely her weeks of silence had convinced him that she was not worth the effort, that his aunt had been right about her unsuitability. The Duke saw her the moment she entered, though he stood on the far side of the ballroom, engaged in conversation with Lord Pemberton and several other gentlemen, and the relief that flooded through him was so profound it nearly unmanned him, for he had begun to fear she would never emerge from her self-imposed exile, that he had lost her to whatever demons of self-doubt had driven her away, and he excused himself with barely concealed impatience, cutting through the crowd with such singular purpose that conversations paused and heads turned to follow his trajectory, speculation rippling through the assembly like wind across water. Eleanor did not see his approach, lost as she was in her own spiraling thoughts, and she started violently when his voice came from just beside her, low and urgent and tinged with emotions she could not quite name. "Miss Hartley, you came." And she turned to find him closer than propriety dictated, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, forced herself to be brave as Charlotte had challenged her to be, and she replied with a voice that trembled only slightly, "I came, Your Grace, though I confess I am not certain why, or what I hope to find here, or whether I have any right to your time after my inexcusable behavior these past weeks." His hand moved as though to take hers, but he checked the gesture, awareness of their public setting restraining him, and he said quietly, fiercely, "You have every right I possess to give, for I have thought of nothing but you since you ceased receiving me, have attended every wretched event in London hoping for precisely this moment, and Miss Hartley, Eleanor, we must speak, truly speak, For I cannot continue this way, cannot endure this separation when I am certain that what exists between us is worth fighting for." Eleanor felt tears gathering behind her eyes at the raw emotion in his voice, and she whispered, "Your aunt was not wrong in her assessment. I bring you nothing but complications and social difficulty. I am not beautiful or accomplished or connected, and you deserve someone who enhances your position rather than diminishes it, someone who belongs in this glittering world rather than hiding behind pillars, watching it pass by." But even as she spoke, the words Charlotte's voice echoed in her mind, asking whether she was being noble or simply cowardly, whether she was protecting him or protecting herself, and she realized with sudden clarity that it was the latter, had always been the latter. The Duke extended his hand with deliberate formality, his voice carrying just enough volume that those nearest could hear. "Miss Hartley, would you do me the honor of this dance?" And Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand, as though it were some foreign object she could not quite comprehend. For she had not danced in years, not since her debut when her mother had forced her onto the floor with a succession of reluctant partners who had counted the minutes until they could escape. And she whispered, "I cannot. I do not dance. You know, I do not dance." But he did not withdraw his hand, instead stepping closer so that his words were for her alone. "You can, Eleanor, and you will, because I am asking you to trust me as I have trusted you with my heart these past months, and because it is time, long past time, for you to step out from behind your pillars and into the light where you belong." She found herself placing her trembling hand in his before conscious thought could intervene, and he led her onto the floor with such assurance that the crowd parted before them like water, conversations dying in their wake as society watched, with barely concealed astonishment, the Duke of Ashworth claiming the wallflower for a waltz, and as the music swelled and his arm came around her waist, Eleanor felt simultaneously exposed and protected, vulnerable and safe, and he began to move with such natural grace that her feet followed of their own accord and muscle memory from long ago dancing lessons, overriding her panic. They circled the floor in silence for several measures, the entire ballroom watching their progress with an attention that made Eleanor's skin prickle with awareness, and then the Duke spoke, his voice low and intense, and filled with something that sounded like barely restrained emotion. "I have watched you for years, Miss Hartley, watched you stand behind pillars at every ball, hide in alcoves at every soirée, slip into libraries and gardens and any space where you might escape notice, and I have marveled at your ability to remain so completely yourself in a world that demands performance and pretense from everyone within it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and tears began to gather in her eyes, despite her desperate attempt to maintain composure, and he continued, guiding her through a turn with effortless skill. "I have watched you observe the world with those remarkable eyes that see everything. I have watched you find contentment in solitude, while others scramble desperately for attention. And I have fallen so deeply in love with you that I can no longer imagine my life without you in it. I can no longer pretend that duty or propriety or society's opinions matter more than the simple truth that you are the only woman I have ever wanted, will ever want. And I am asking you now, before all these witnesses, to choose me as I have chosen you, to step forward into this life we might build together despite every reasonable objection anyone might raise." The ballroom had gone utterly silent around them, the music playing on, but every conversation ceased, every eye fixed upon the Duke and the unremarkable woman in his arms, and Eleanor felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical pressure, but she also felt the strength of his hand at her waist, the steadiness of his gaze, and she found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I am afraid, so terribly afraid, that I will disappoint you. That time will reveal me to be exactly what your aunt claimed, exactly what society believes me to be, and you will come to regret this choice." His hand tightened on hers, and he said with absolute conviction, "The only thing I will regret is if you allow fear to steal this happiness from us both, if you choose safety over love, invisibility over life. And Eleanor, I am making this declaration publicly, irrevocably, so that you might understand I am not acting from pity or temporary fascination, but from a love so certain that I am willing to claim you before all of society and dare them to find fault with my choice." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, heedless of the hundreds of eyes watching, and she saw in his expression such tenderness, such unwavering certainty, that something within her that had been locked away for years finally broke free, and she whispered, "I love you. I have loved you perhaps since that first conversation in the library, though I told myself it was impossible, told myself you could never truly see me, and I am terrified. But I am also, for the first time in my life, willing to be brave." The music ended, but Eleanor barely noticed, her vision blurred with tears and her heart pounding so violently she feared the entire ballroom must hear it. And the Duke's hand remained steady at her waist, even as the other dancers began to disperse around them, their whispered speculations creating a buzz of sound that seemed to press against Eleanor's skin like a physical force, and she became suddenly, acutely aware of every eye upon her, every head turned in their direction, every fan fluttering with gossip, and panic seized her throat with such force that she could scarcely breathe, the old familiar terror of visibility threatening to overwhelm the fragile courage she had summoned moments before. The Duke saw the fear in her eyes, recognized the trembling that had begun in her hands, and without a word, he guided her through the crowd with such authority that people stepped aside instinctively, creating a path toward the tall glass doors that led to the terrace. And Eleanor found herself grateful beyond measure for his steadying presence, even as her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear back into the comfortable obscurity from which she should never have emerged. And she heard Lady Pemberton's scandalized whisper as they passed, "In my day, a gentleman would never make such a spectacle." And Miss Catherine Winter's cutting response, "In any day, a woman of her station would know better than to encourage a duke's attentions." But the Duke's expression remained impassive, his hand firm at her elbow as he led her into the cool night air of the terrace, where the sounds of the ballroom faded to a muted hum behind them. The November air struck Eleanor's overheated skin like a blessing, and she drew in great gasping breaths, while the Duke closed the terrace doors behind them, affording them a measure of privacy, though Eleanor knew their absence would only fuel further speculation. And when he turned to face her, his expression held such tenderness mixed with concern that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she whispered, "I cannot do this, cannot be what you need me to be, cannot stand in the center of all those stares and whispers and judgments. I am not strong enough, was never meant for this kind of attention." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true, knew that what terrified her was not the attention itself, but rather the possibility that she might prove unworthy of it, that she might fail him in some fundamental way and justify every doubt society harbored about their match. The Duke moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with such gentleness that Eleanor's breath caught, and he said quietly, urgently, "Eleanor, look at me, truly look at me, and understand that I am not asking you to become someone else. I'm not asking you to transform into the sort of woman society expects a duchess to be. I am asking only that you be exactly who you are, the woman who finds peace in solitude and wisdom in observation, the woman who values substance over spectacle and authenticity over performance, because that woman, that remarkable woman, is the one I love with every part of my being." And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental restructuring of how she understood herself and her place in the world, and she whispered through her tears, "I do not know how to be brave in the way you are asking, do not know how to stand beside you without feeling that I diminish you somehow." His thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite care, and he said, "Then let me teach you. Let me show you every day for the rest of our lives that you elevate rather than diminish, that your presence brings me more joy than any amount of social approval ever could." And then he drew a small velvet box from his pocket, sinking to one knee on the cold terrace stones with such natural grace that Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, muffling the sob that rose in her throat, and he opened the box to reveal a ring of simple elegance, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the light from the ballroom and threw it back in brilliant fragments. And he said with absolute conviction, "Miss Eleanor Hartley, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of building a life with me that honors both who we are and who we might become together, of standing beside me not as my shadow but as my equal, my partner, my most beloved companion in all things?" And Eleanor looked down at him. This remarkable man who had seen her when she believed herself invisible, who had loved her when she thought herself unlovable, and she felt the last of her defenses crumble into dust, felt courage rise in their place like spring flowers breaking through winter earth, and she whispered, "Yes, yes, I will marry you, though I am still terrified and uncertain and convinced I do not deserve such happiness, but I love you too much to let fear steal this from us. Love you enough to try to be brave." The announcement of their engagement appeared in the morning papers 2 days later, a formal notice that sent ripples of reaction through London society like a stone cast into still water, and Eleanor discovered that the world divided itself quite neatly into those who condemned the match as a profound misalliance and those who found in it an unexpected romance, though she suspected the latter group was considerably smaller than the former, and she learned this division first-hand when she accompanied her mother and the Duke to Lady Ashford's musicale, where the whispers followed them like shadows, and Eleanor heard Miss Catherine Winters proclaim with barely concealed disdain, "He has thrown himself away on a nobody, a woman without fortune or beauty or any quality that might justify such a spectacular descent, and mark my words, he will come to regret this moment of misguided nobility within a year." While across the room, elderly Lady Thornbury observed to her companion with surprising warmth, "I find it rather refreshing that a gentleman of his standing chose affection over advantage, chose a woman of substance over a woman of spectacle, and perhaps there is hope for this generation after all." The Duke remained utterly unmoved by the varied reactions, his hand steady at Eleanor's elbow as he guided her through the crowded drawing-room with such obvious devotion that even the most skeptical observers could not deny the genuineness of his attachment, and when Lord Pemberton made a cutting remark about fortune hunters that was clearly intended for Eleanor's ears, the Duke fixed him with such a glacial stare that the man actually stepped backward, and Eleanor felt simultaneously mortified by the conflict and grateful for his unwavering defense, though she wished desperately that she might simply disappear and spare everyone the spectacle of their controversial union. Mrs. Hartley moved through society with barely concealed triumph, accepting congratulations with an air that suggested she had orchestrated the entire affair through her superior maternal guidance, and Eleanor found her mother's pride almost as difficult to bear as society's censure, for it reduced their love to a social achievement rather than the profound connection it truly was. But Charlotte squeezed her hand during a particularly trying afternoon call and whispered, "Let her have this moment, for she has lived her entire life measuring worth by society's standards, and she cannot conceive that you have achieved something far greater than a strategic match." And Eleanor felt gratitude wash over her for her sister's understanding, for Charlotte alone seemed to grasp that this engagement represented not a triumph over other women in the marriage market, but rather a triumph over her own fear and self-doubt. Support came from unexpected quarters as well, for the Duke's closest friend, Lord Blackwood, called upon them specifically to express his approval, saying to Eleanor with genuine warmth, "I have known Ashworth since we were boys at Eton, have watched him navigate society's expectations with the weariness of a man performing a role rather than living a life, and I have never seen him as authentically happy as he has been these past months, never seen him choose his own desires over duty's demands, and I am grateful to you, Miss Hartley, for giving him permission to be himself." And Eleanor found herself blinking back tears at this validation from someone whose opinion the Duke clearly valued. The days following the announcement brought a constant stream of callers, some genuinely pleased, and others clearly driven by curiosity about the woman who had captured the Duke's heart, and Eleanor discovered that she was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to hold her head high despite the scrutiny, to meet critical gazes without immediately searching for a pillar behind which to hide, and though the effort exhausted her and sent her retreating to her room each evening with trembling hands and racing heart, she found that each day became fractionally easier than the last, each social encounter slightly less terrifying, and she understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but rather the willingness to persist despite it, and the Duke's constant presence, his quiet pride in her, his refusal to acknowledge society's objections as legitimate, gave her strength she had never known she possessed. The weeks that followed their engagement unfolded with a strange duality, for Eleanor found herself simultaneously under the most intense scrutiny of her life, while also experiencing moments of profound intimacy and joy that made the outside world seem distant and inconsequential, and she discovered that being engaged to the Duke of Ashworth meant that her every movement, every word, Every choice of dress or expression became subject to society's relentless examination, with matrons whispering behind their fans about whether she would embarrass him at court, and debutantes speculating with barely concealed envy about what secret arts she must have employed to capture such a prize. Yet through it all, the Duke remained her constant anchor, appearing at the Hartley residence each afternoon with such regularity that even Mrs. Hartley ceased her fluttering excitement and began to treat his presence as a natural part of their daily rhythm, and Eleanor found herself growing stronger under his steady regard, found that each public appearance became fractionally easier as she learned to focus on his face rather than the sea of judgmental eyes surrounding them, and she noticed with wonder that she no longer instinctively searched for pillars behind which to hide, no longer felt the overwhelming urge to make herself invisible, though the old fears still whispered in quiet moments that she was merely playing a role she could never truly inhabit. The Duke's family, initially reserved in their reception of the engagement, began to warm to Eleanor's genuine nature as they came to know her beyond society's superficial assessments, and his younger sister, Lady Margaret, confessed during a private tea that she had feared her brother would marry one of the calculating beauties who pursued him so relentlessly, and she found Eleanor's lack of pretense refreshing beyond measure, saying with surprising frankness, "You do not perform for us, do not attempt to impress or manipulate, and I think that is precisely why my brother loves you, for he has spent his entire life surrounded by people who want something from him, and you want only him, the man beneath the title." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this understanding, at the recognition that her very ordinariness, the quality she had always perceived as her greatest failing, was in fact the characteristic that had drawn the Duke to her in the first place. The wedding preparations consumed much of Eleanor's time, with her mother orchestrating the affair with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania, insisting on the finest fabrics and most elaborate decorations, despite the Duke's quiet assurance that he cared nothing for spectacle, wanting only Eleanor as his bride. And Eleanor found herself caught between gratitude for her mother's joy and exhaustion at the constant fittings and consultations and decisions about details that seemed monumentally unimportant compared to the profound commitment she was preparing to make, yet she endured it all with growing grace, learning that sometimes love meant allowing others their happiness even when it conflicted with one's own preferences, and she discovered unexpected pleasure in selecting flowers for the ceremony, in choosing readings that spoke to the journey she and the Duke had traveled together, in imagining the moment when she would walk toward him down the aisle of St. George's and promise herself to him before God and witnesses. The quiet moments between public obligations became precious beyond measure, stolen hours when the Duke would call and they would walk in the small garden behind the Hartley house, or sit in the parlor reading companionably while Mrs. Hartley dozed in her chair, and it was in these unremarkable interludes that Eleanor felt their love deepen into something richer than romance, something that resembled true partnership, and he told her about his childhood, about the loneliness of being raised for duty rather than happiness, about watching his parents' cold, strategic marriage and vowing never to replicate their emotional distance, and she shared with him her own history of feeling perpetually inadequate, of believing herself fundamentally unworthy of notice or affection, and he listened with such attentiveness, such genuine interest in the workings of her mind and heart, that she found herself revealing thoughts and fears she had never before spoken aloud, and in the speaking of them, they lost some of their power, became manageable rather than overwhelming, and she understood that this was what marriage should be, this gradual unveiling of souls, this patient building of intimacy through accumulated moments of vulnerability and trust. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned clear and bright, with autumn sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and touching the ivory silk of her gown with gold, and she stood before the mirror while her mother and Charlotte helped fasten the countless tiny buttons that ran down her spine, and she barely recognized the woman gazing back at her, not because she had been transformed into a beauty, for her features remained as unremarkable as ever, her figure still slender to the point of thinness, her complexion still pale rather than fashionably rosy, but because something fundamental had shifted in her expression, a quiet confidence that softened the anxiety in her eyes, a sense of purpose that straightened her shoulders, and she thought with wonder that she was about to walk down the aisle of St. George's, Hanover Square, before hundreds of London's elite, The very people who had watched her hide behind pillars and dismissed her as inconsequential, and yet the thought no longer filled her with paralyzing dread, but rather with a trembling excitement, for at the end of that long walk stood the man who had seen her when she believed herself invisible, who had loved her not despite her ordinariness, but because of the authentic soul it housed. And Mrs. Hartley wept openly as she placed the delicate veil over Eleanor's face, saying through her tears, "I never imagined this day would come, never dared hope that you would make such a match, and though I know I have been difficult and demanding, and perhaps have not always understood you, I want you to know that I am proud, so very proud of the woman you have become." And Eleanor embraced her mother with sudden, fierce affection, understanding that Mrs. Hartley's social ambitions had been born from love, however misguided, from a desire to see her daughter secure and valued in a world that measured worth by such shallow metrics. And Charlotte squeezed her hand and whispered, "He is waiting for you, and he has been waiting for years, and today you finally walk toward him rather than away, and there is such poetry in that, such perfect rightness." And then they were descending the stairs where her father waited, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire, but offering his arm with gentle dignity, and the carriage ride to the church passed in a blur of nervous anticipation, and Eleanor's hands trembled as they arrived, and she heard the organ's majestic tones echoing through the ancient stone sanctuary, and then the great doors opened, and she stood at the threshold, gazing down the impossibly long aisle, lined with flowers and candles, and the turned heads of society's finest, and for one terrible moment, the old fear rose up and threatened to overwhelm her, the urge to flee, to hide, to disappear. But then her eyes found him standing at the altar in his formal black and white, tall and steady and utterly focused on her, as though the hundreds of observers simply did not exist. And his face held such open emotion, such unguarded love and anticipation, that everything else fell away, and there was only him, only the man who had watched her for years and chosen her above all others. And Eleanor began to walk, her father's arm supporting but not carrying her, and she walked not with the tentative steps of a woman uncertain of her welcome, but with growing sureness, walked toward the future she had never dared imagine, and with each step she felt the weight of old shame and inadequacy falling away like discarded chains. And when she reached him, and he took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers, and his eyes bright with unshed tears, she felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of homecoming, of arriving at last at the place she was always meant to be. And the ceremony unfolded with solemn beauty, the Archbishop's voice intoning the ancient words about love and commitment and the joining of two souls. And when the Duke spoke his vows, his voice was steady and clear, promising to love and cherish and honor her all the days of his life. And Eleanor's voice trembled but held as she made the same promises, and she meant every word with a depth of feeling that made her chest ache. And then he was sliding the ring onto her finger, the gold warm against her skin, a physical symbol of the bond they were forging. And the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, and the Duke lifted her veil with such tenderness, such reverence, and kissed her before God and society with a sweetness that made her breath catch, and the congregation erupted in applause, and Eleanor turned to face them all, no longer Miss Eleanor Hartley, who hid behind pillars, but rather the Duchess of Ashworth, who stood beside her husband in the full light of day. And at the reception that followed in the Duke's magnificent London residence, Eleanor moved through the receiving line, meeting congratulations with growing ease, and she danced with her husband as their guests looked on. And she no longer searched for shadows in which to conceal herself, but rather allowed herself to be seen, to be celebrated. And when at last they departed in his carriage, bound for his country estate, rice and flower petals raining down upon them, Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt such profound gratitude for the courage that had brought her to this moment, for the love that had called her out of hiding and into the fullness of life. The months that followed their wedding unfolded with a gentleness that Eleanor had never known existed for life, as the Duchess of Ashworth proved to be not the performance of constant social obligations she had feared, but rather an expansion of freedom she had never dared imagine possible, and they settled into the Duke's country estate with a profound sense of homecoming, the ancient stone manor, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient forests, becoming a sanctuary where Eleanor could finally breathe without the weight of society's judgment pressing upon her chest. and she discovered that her husband had meant his vows with a literalness that still astonished her, for he truly honored her preferences and desires, never forcing her to host grand entertainments or attend every social gathering, instead creating a life that balanced his necessary public duties with long stretches of private tranquility. And Eleanor found herself transforming not into someone else, but rather into a fuller version of herself, the woman she might have been had she not spent years believing her worth negligible. And she moved through the great rooms of Ashworth Hall with growing confidence, making small changes that reflected her tastes, filling the library with new volumes and creating cozy reading nooks where she and the Duke would spend long evenings in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own books yet connected by an invisible thread of shared contentment. And the servants who had initially regarded her with skepticism gradually warmed to her genuine kindness and lack of pretension, for she treated them as human beings rather than invisible functionaries, remembering their names and asking after their families. And Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, confessed one afternoon that she had served the Duke's family for 30 years and never seen the master so happy, so at peace, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with gratitude for this unexpected life, this marriage that had begun in fear and doubt, but deepened daily into something profound and sustaining. The Duke proved to be a man of surprising depths, revealing facets of himself he had kept hidden beneath the polished veneer required of his position, and Eleanor learned that he shared her love of quiet mornings and starlit evenings, that he too found the constant performance of social life exhausting, that he had chosen her not as an act of charity or whim, but because he recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who valued authenticity over appearance, substance over spectacle, and they would walk for hours through the estate's grounds discussing philosophy and literature and the state of the world, conversations that ranged from playful to profound. And Eleanor discovered that she possessed opinions and insights worth sharing, that her years of observation from the shadows had given her a unique perspective on human nature, and her husband listened to her thoughts with genuine interest, often saying that she saw truths others missed precisely because she had spent so long watching rather than performing. And these affirmations, repeated through countless small moments, gradually rewrote the narrative Eleanor had constructed about herself, replacing the story of inadequacy with one of quiet strength and inherent value. Society's initial shock at their marriage eventually mellowed into acceptance, for the Duke's happiness was evident to all who saw them together, and even the most hardened critics found it difficult to maintain their disapproval in the face of such obvious devotion. And Eleanor learned to navigate social obligations with growing grace, no longer hiding behind pillars, but standing beside her husband with her head raised. And though she would never be comfortable at the center of attention, she found that she could endure it when necessary, knowing that she had a sanctuary to return to, a home where she could be simply herself rather than a duchess performing a role. And she discovered unexpected allies among other women who had felt similarly constrained by society's narrow definitions of worth and beauty. And together they created small rebellions, hosting salons focused on intellectual discourse rather than gossip, supporting charitable causes that actually helped rather than merely provided opportunities for social display. And Eleanor found purpose in using her position to make space for others who felt invisible, remembering too well the pain of believing oneself beneath notice. The realization of her own worth came not in a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulation of days and weeks and months of being loved, truly loved, by a man whose judgment she trusted. And Eleanor understood gradually that she had always possessed value, that her years of hiding had been a response to society's failure to recognize her rather than evidence of her inadequacy. And this understanding brought with it a profound sense of liberation, a release from the prison of self-doubt she had constructed around her own heart. And she looked back at the woman who had stood behind pillars with compassion rather than shame, recognizing that survival sometimes required making oneself small, but that true living demanded the courage to occupy space, to be seen, to risk rejection in pursuit of connection. And she was grateful beyond measure that the Duke had possessed the patience to wait for her, to watch her for years until she was finally ready to step into the light and claim the love he offered. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Hartley became the Duchess of Ashworth, 5 years that had transformed her life in ways she still marveled at during quiet moments of reflection. And on this particular autumn evening, She stood at the edge of a London ballroom, remarkably similar to the one where her story had truly begun, though her position had shifted dramatically from those years when she had hidden behind marble pillars. For now she stood in full view beside her husband, watching the swirling dancers with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to navigate society's treacherous waters, and her hand rested in the crook of the Duke's arm with an ease born of countless such moments, and she wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented rather than transformed her still slender figure, and her dark hair was dressed elegantly but simply, and she had never become a beauty by conventional standards, her features remaining as unremarkable as ever. Yet there was something in her bearing now, a quiet dignity and self-possession that drew eyes nonetheless, and the Duke stood beside her as he always did, his presence steady and reassuring, and Eleanor felt his fingers cover hers in a gentle squeeze, and she glanced up to meet his gaze and saw there the same devotion that had sustained her through the difficult early days of their marriage, the same deep regard that had called her out of shadows and into light, and he smiled at her with such warmth that her heart expanded in her chest, and she thought with wonder that 5 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, that the love which had seemed so improbable in those early days had grown into something vast and unshakable, rooted in genuine understanding and shared values, and they had weathered challenges together, the loss of his father, and her assumption of greater responsibilities as the primary duchess of the family, the difficulty of Eleanor's first pregnancy, and the joy of their daughter's birth, the ongoing navigation of society's expectations and their own desires for a quieter life. And through it all they had remained fundamentally united, partners in the truest sense, and Eleanor had discovered within herself reserves of strength she had never suspected, finding that motherhood suited her in unexpected ways, that she could advocate fiercely for causes she believed in, that she could host gatherings that mattered and decline those that did not, and she had learned to distinguish between the opinions that deserved consideration and those that reflected only small-mindedness and prejudice, and the Duke had supported every step of her evolution, never trying to shape her into something she was not, but rather celebrating the woman she was becoming. And now they watched their 3-year-old daughter, Lady Catherine, being led in a careful dance by her doting grandfather, and the child's laughter rang through the ballroom like bells, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the sight, for Catherine possessed a confidence and joy that Eleanor had never known as a child, and she was determined that her daughter would grow up believing in her own worth, regardless of whether society deemed her beautiful or accomplished, and she would teach Catherine to value authenticity over performance, to seek connection rather than approval, to understand that true worth came from within and was validated by genuine love rather than public acclaim. And the Duke leaned close and whispered, "She has your eyes and your spirit, you know, that quality of seeing clearly through pretense." And Eleanor smiled and replied, "And your kindness, your ability to make others feel valued." And they stood together watching their daughter twirl with abandoned joy. And Eleanor thought back to the woman she had been 5 years ago, the one who had believed herself invisible and unworthy, and she felt such compassion for that younger self, such gratitude that she had found the courage to accept love when it was offered, and she glanced around the ballroom and noticed a young woman standing partially concealed behind a column, watching the festivities with the careful attention of someone who participates through observation rather than action, and Eleanor recognized that posture, that protective distance, and she felt a kinship with this unknown girl, and she made a mental note to seek an introduction, to perhaps offer a kind word or genuine attention, for she remembered too well how much such gestures could matter to someone who felt overlooked, and the Duke followed her gaze and understood immediately, for he knew her history and her heart, and he said quietly, "Shall we?" And Eleanor nodded, and together they began to make their way across the ballroom, no longer the watcher and the watched, but rather two souls united in purpose, moving through the glittering crowd toward a young woman who might need to learn what Eleanor had discovered. That being seen, truly seen, by even one person who values what they find can change everything, and that love patient enough to wait and strong enough to call forth courage can transform a life completely. And as they walked, Eleanor felt the weight of her own journey settling into wisdom, into something she could offer others, and she thought that perhaps this was the greatest gift of her unlikely story, not just her own happiness, but the capacity it had given her to recognize and nurture the worth in others who still stood in shadows, still waited to be found. Dear listener, if you have journeyed with us through this tale of Eleanor and her Duke, perhaps you have recognized something of yourself in these pages, for we have all stood behind our own pillars at times, have all felt the weight of believing ourselves unworthy of notice or love, have all constructed protective distances between ourselves and a world that seems to value only certain kinds of beauty, certain types of accomplishment, certain narrow definitions of worth. And Eleanor's story reminds us that being truly seen, genuinely perceived in all our complexity and particularity, can be the most transformative gift one human being can offer another. For the Duke did not fall in love with an idealized version of Eleanor or a potential she might fulfill if properly molded, but rather with the authentic woman she already was, the quiet observer who found contentment in books and solitude, who possessed depths that superficial society overlooked, who had learned to survive by making herself invisible, but who carried within her a spirit worthy of devotion, and his patient watching, his willingness to wait years for the right moment to approach, teaches us that genuine love does not rush or force, but rather create space for the beloved to arrive at their own readiness, to step forward from shadows when courage finally outweighs fear. And Eleanor's gradual acceptance of his regard, her slow unfurling from protective distance into vulnerable connection, shows us that transformation happens not through dramatic gestures alone, but through the accumulation of small moments of genuine seeing and being seen, through conversations that honor rather than diminish, through patience that allows trust to grow at its own pace. And perhaps the deepest truth of their story lies in the recognition that worthiness is not something we earn through accomplishment or appearance, but rather something we possess inherently, something that love can help us recognize but cannot create. For Eleanor was always worthy of devotion, always possessed value and depth, but she needed someone to reflect that truth back to her consistently and genuinely until she could finally believe it herself. And this is the gift we might offer one another in our own lives, this capacity to truly see those who feel invisible, to recognize worth in places society overlooks, to practice the kind of patient attention that allows others to gradually believe in their own value. And if you find yourself standing behind pillars even now, hiding from a world that seems to have no place for you, know that your story need not end in shadows, that authentic connection exists for those willing to risk being seen, that somewhere there may be someone already watching, already recognizing your particular worth, already waiting with the patience that genuine regard requires. And even if such a person has not yet appeared, you can begin the work of seeing yourself clearly, of recognizing that society's narrow judgments reflect its limitations rather than your inadequacy, of understanding that a life lived authentically, even in quiet corners, possesses more genuine value than a lifetime of performance and pretense. And may you find the courage that Eleanor discovered, the willingness to step into light and risk rejection in pursuit of connection. And may you encounter the kind of love that sees you whole and wants you exactly as you are. And may you extend that same generous seeing to others who wait in shadows. And may your days be filled with moments of genuine recognition and your nights with the peace that comes from being truly known. And may you rest well in the understanding that your story, like Eleanor's, is still unfolding toward possibilities you cannot yet imagine. And may you find comfort and inspiration in these tales we share. And if this story has touched your heart, perhaps you might subscribe to Enchanted Quill Stories, where more such narratives await. Stories of transformation and redemption, of love that sees truly and waits patiently, of lives that bloom when finally given space to grow. And may you carry Eleanor's journey with you as a reminder that being seen, truly seen, can change everything, and that you are worthy of such seeing, always have been, always will be.